She was 22 and homeless, no family, no money, just an old car and a backpack full of clothes. Then, one cold night, she spent her last savings on an abandoned mansion deep in Louisiana. People in town called Ravenwood Manor cursed. They said girls disappeared there. They said nobody stayed long inside that house. But Rosie Lambert had already lost everything. And what nobody knew was that the abandoned mansion she bought was hiding secrets connected to her own family secrets buried for decades behind locked doors and broken walls. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe if you love emotional mystery stories like this. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Rosie Lambert had frostbitten fingers, worn-out sneakers soaked from melted snow, and a heart that had spent too many nights learning how to survive alone. At 22 years old, she owned almost nothing. No apartment, no family, no place that truly felt like home. For the last 3 years, she'd been sleeping in the back seat of a rusted Honda Civic parked behind an old church on the south side of Chicago. During the day, she worked double shifts at a diner off Route 41, carrying plates with tired smiles while customers barely looked her in the eye. At night, she wrapped herself in donated blankets and listened to the city howl around her. After losing both parents in a fire when she was 16, Rosie drifted from shelters to temporary jobs, from couches to cold sidewalks. People called her unlucky. But deep down, Rosie felt something worse. Forgotten. One freezing night, sitting inside her car with weak heat barely fogging the windshield, she scrolled through abandoned property listings on her cracked phone, not because she could afford them, but because imagining another life helped her fall asleep. That's when she saw it. An enormous mansion hidden deep in rural Louisiana. Dark windows, collapsing balconies, vines strangling the walls, and beneath the grainy photograph, just 4 words. Estate abandoned after tragedy. Rosie stared at the screen for a long time. Something about the house felt familiar. Like grief recognizing grief. And before fear could stop her, she clicked. Place bid. Rosie Lambert didn't fully understand what she'd done until the confirmation email arrived at 3:17 in the morning. She stared at the cracked screen of her phone, eyes burning from exhaustion as the words settled into her chest like cold iron. Congratulations, your bid has been accepted. For a long moment, she just sat there inside the freezing Honda Civic, the engine off to save gas, her breath fogging the windows. A mansion. She had somehow bought a mansion. Not a home, not a trailer, not some tiny fixer-upper in a forgotten neighborhood. A real mansion. Somewhere in Louisiana. Rosie let out a nervous laugh that quickly dissolved into silence. Outside, snow drifted past the church parking lot where she'd been sleeping for nearly a year. The city lights blurred through the frosted windshield, while distant sirens echoed somewhere downtown. What the hell did I just do? She whispered. But deep down, she already knew the answer. She had run out of places to go. Within 10 days, Rosie sold nearly everything she owned, which wasn't much to begin with. Her old guitar, the silver necklace her mother once gave her, even the small portable heater she relied on during winter nights. She kept only the essentials. A duffel bag of clothes, a box of canned food, a flashlight, a worn blanket from the shelter, and an old photograph of her parents smiling on a beach she barely remembered. The drive south felt endless. Chicago disappeared behind her in waves of gray concrete and dirty snow. Then came highways, empty farmland, dying gas stations, forgotten towns. Hour after hour, mile after mile, Rosie watched the world grow quieter. By the second night, her radio stopped working. By the third day, even her GPS signal began cutting in and out. The roads narrowed into long stretches of cracked pavement wrapped in thick forests. Moss hung from twisted trees like old funeral veils. Fog clung low to the ground. And then, just before sunset, she saw the sign. Blackwood, Hollow Population, 312. Rosie slowed the car instinctively. The town looked frozen in time. A diner with flickering lights, a gas station with 2 rusted pumps, an old pharmacy with boarded windows, people sitting silently on porches watching her pass. No one smiled. No one waved. It felt less like entering a town, and more like crossing into a memory no one wanted disturbed. Her stomach tightened. The mansion sat nearly 2 miles outside town at the end of a dirt road almost swallowed by weeds. Branches scraped against her car as she drove deeper into the woods. Then suddenly, there it was. Ravenwood Manor. Rosie's breath caught instantly. The house rose from the darkness like something abandoned by time itself. 3 stories tall, massive, decaying. Its black shutters hung crooked from rusted hinges. Vines crawled across the stone walls like veins. Parts of the roof had collapsed inward, leaving jagged holes against the evening sky. The enormous front porch sagged dangerously to one side. And the windows. God, the windows looked like empty eyes, watching her. Rosie parked slowly in front of the mansion and shut off the engine. Silence rushed in immediately. No birds, no wind, nothing. Just stillness. For several seconds, she couldn't move. Every survival instinct she had screamed at her to turn around, to drive away while she still could. But then she looked down at the photograph of her parents resting in the passenger seat, and something inside her hardened. If this place falls apart, she muttered softly, at least it'll fall apart with me inside it. She stepped out of the car. The cold air smelled like rain, rotting wood, and damp earth. Her boots crunched across dead leaves as she approached the porch. Every step made the old boards groan beneath her weight. She tilted her head back slowly, staring up at the towering mansion disappearing into shadows above her. "You're worse than I imagined," she whispered. But somehow, that only made her love it more. Inside, the mansion felt colder than outside. The front door opened with a long, painful creak that echoed through the massive foyer. Dust drifted through beams of fading light. The air smelled ancient mold, smoke, mildew, and something else she couldn't identify. Something stale, something trapped. Rosie stepped carefully across warped floorboards, her flashlight trembling slightly in her hand. The foyer was enormous once. A grand staircase curved upward into darkness. Torn wallpaper peeled from the walls in long strips. Above her hung a giant chandelier coated in decades of dust and cobwebs. It felt like the house had been abandoned in the middle of a sentence. She swallowed hard. Then, creak. Rosie froze. The sound came from upstairs. Slow, heavy, like footsteps. Her heart slammed against her ribs. "Hello," she called weakly. No answer. Only silence. She told herself it was old wood settling, the wind shifting through broken walls. But there was no wind tonight. Rosie forced herself to keep moving. She found what looked like an old sitting room near the foyer and dropped her bags beside the wall, too exhausted to explore further. She unrolled her blanket onto the dusty hardwood floor. Darkness swallowed the mansion quickly after sunset. Every sound felt amplified. The groaning walls, the soft ticking somewhere deep inside the house, the occasional crack from upstairs. Rosie barely slept, and sometime after midnight, she heard it. A voice, soft, faint, almost impossible to understand. a woman whispering somewhere deep inside the walls. Rosie's eyes flew open instantly. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she sat upright in the darkness. Then the whisper came again, closer this time. Not angry, not threatening, but sad. So unbelievably sad. Rosie grabbed her flashlight with shaking hands and aimed it toward the staircase. And for one terrifying second, she thought she saw someone standing there. A girl, thin, pale, motionless in the dark. Then the flashlight flickered, and the figure was gone. Rosie stopped breathing. The mansion fell silent once more, but deep inside her chest, she knew. She was not alone in Ravenwood Manor. The next morning, Rosie Lambert convinced herself she had imagined everything. The whisper, the figure at the staircase, the feeling of being watched. Lack of sleep could do strange things to a person, especially someone already carrying years of grief and exhaustion inside them. That's what she told herself, anyway. But as sunlight pushed weakly through the filthy windows of Ravenwood Manor, the house looked no less unsettling. If anything, it looked worse. Rosie stepped outside onto the collapsing porch, wrapping her thin coat tighter around herself as cold fog drifted across the property. In daylight, she could finally see just how enormous the estate truly was. Overgrown gardens stretched into the woods like something swallowed by nature decades ago. Rusted gates leaned sideways beneath vines. Dead fountains sat cracked and empty. And behind the mansion, a cemetery. Small, forgotten, hidden beneath tangled weeds and crooked stone markers. Rosie stared at it silently. A strange heaviness settled in her chest again. The kind that didn't feel like fear. The kind that felt personal. She spent most of the day cleaning the foyer just to keep herself distracted. Dust filled the air as she swept broken glass and fallen plaster into piles. She opened windows that hadn't moved in years. Some shattered the moment she touched them. By late afternoon, her muscles ached. But for the first time in years, she felt useful. Needed, like the house itself had been waiting for someone not to abandon it. As evening approached, Rosie wandered deeper into the mansion carrying only a flashlight and a crowbar she'd found near the kitchen. Room after room revealed more decay. A dining hall covered in mildew, bedrooms frozen in time, portraits hanging crookedly on stained walls. But one room stopped her cold. It was at the end of the west hallway behind a pair of partially collapsed doors. A child's bedroom. Dust-covered toys still sat on shelves. A tiny rocking chair rested beside the fireplace. Faded wallpaper covered in painted stars peeled from the walls. And sitting neatly in the center of the bed was a doll. Rosie's stomach tightened instantly. The doll looked old, handmade. Its stitched face faded with age, but that wasn't what terrified her. It looked clean, far too clean, as if someone had touched it recently. Rosie stepped closer slowly, then froze. There were footprints in the dust. Small ones, bare feet, leading from the doorway to the bed. Her breathing became shallow. "Nope," she whispered immediately, backing away. "Nope, absolutely not." But before she could leave, thud. A loud crash echoed somewhere below her. Rosie nearly screamed. The sound came from downstairs, near the foyer. Heart pounding violently, she gripped the crowbar tighter and hurried into the hallway. Every floorboard groaned beneath her feet as darkness swallowed the mansion around her. "Hello," she called shakily. No answer, only silence. Then, another sound, a faint metallic clink, coming from behind the walls. Rosie followed it carefully down the staircase and toward the back of the mansion. The noise seemed distant but rhythmic somehow. Clink, 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 like metal tapping against stone. The farther she walked, the colder the air became. Eventually, she reached the old kitchen, or what remained of it. Cabinets hung open, pots and pans littered the floor. Part of the ceiling had collapsed inward years ago. Then Rosie noticed something strange. One section of the floor tiles looked newer than the others. Not new exactly, just less ruined. She crouched carefully beside them, brushing away layers of dirt with trembling fingers. And there, a metal ring embedded into the floor. Her pulse quickened. No way. Using the crowbar, Rosie wedged beneath the ring and pulled. At first, nothing happened. Then suddenly, crack! The wooden panel beneath the tile shifted upward, releasing a cloud of stale air so foul she stumbled backward, coughing. A hidden door. Beneath the kitchen floor, Rosie stared at the darkness below. Every instinct told her not to go down there. But curiosity had always been stronger than fear. She grabbed her flashlight and climbed carefully down the narrow wooden stairs. The smell grew worse instantly. Damp earth, mold, rust. The underground space beneath Ravenwood Manor was larger than she expected, more like a hidden basement than a crawlspace. Stone walls curved around narrow corridors lined with shelves and broken crates. Then her flashlight landed on something that made her stop breathing. Photographs. Hundreds of them. Pinned across the walls. Children. Women. Families. Most black and white. Some burned around the edges. And every single face looked terrified. Rosie moved slowly through the room, flashlight shaking violently in her hand. Some photographs had names written beneath them. Others had dates. Many were children from local orphanages dating back nearly 70 years. A sick feeling twisted inside her stomach. Then she saw one photo that made the blood drain from her face completely. A young woman standing on the front porch of Ravenwood Manor. Long dark hair, soft eyes, a familiar smile. Rosie dropped the flashlight. No, she whispered. It was her mother. Younger, maybe 18, but unmistakably her. The photo slipped from Rosie's trembling fingers as panic surged through her chest. Her mother had never mentioned this place. Never. Rosie staggered backward, struggling to breathe. And that's when she noticed the journal sitting beside the photograph. Old leather, partially burned. She opened it carefully. The first page was nearly destroyed by water damage, but the handwriting beneath it was still readable. And the moment Rosie recognized the signature at the bottom, her knees nearly gave out. Clara Lambert. Her mother. Rosie flipped through pages frantically. Entries about Ravenwood Manor. About missing children. About secrets hidden beneath the estate. About trying to escape. Then, one final sentence written shakily across the last surviving page. If anything happens to me, never let them reopen the West Wing. Rosie's chest tightened painfully. 'Cause upstairs, the West Wing door had been open when she arrived. Suddenly, bang! A deafening slam echoed above her. The basement lights flickered once, twice. Then darkness swallowed everything. Rosie gasped as something moved somewhere deep within the basement corridor. Not an animal. Footsteps. Slow. Dragging. Coming toward her. And from the darkness ahead, a little girl's voice whispered softly, "You shouldn't have come back." Rosie Lambert couldn't move. The darkness inside the hidden basement pressed against her like wet concrete, thick and suffocating. Her flashlight had rolled somewhere across the stone floor, its weak beam flickering sideways through the corridor. And somewhere ahead, something was breathing. Slow. Uneven. Rosie's heart slammed painfully against her ribs as she backed away from the voice she'd just heard. "You shouldn't have come back." The words echoed inside her skull. Not come here. Come back. As if the house already knew her. As if some part of her had always belonged to Ravenwood Manor. "Who's there?" Rosie whispered, her voice cracking. No answer. Only the sound of dragging footsteps somewhere deeper underground. Then silence. Absolute silence. Rosie lunged for the flashlight and grabbed it with shaking hands. The beam swept wildly across the basement walls, illuminating old shelves, rusted tools, and rows of photographs staring back at her from the dark. Children. So many children. Fear crawled beneath her skin. But something else was growing too. Anger. Because suddenly this didn't feel like a ghost story anymore. It felt real. Terribly real. Rosie turned back toward the stairs and climbed out of the basement as fast as she could, slamming the hidden floor hatch shut behind her. She stumbled backward across the kitchen, gasping for breath. Rain hammered against the windows now. Thunder rolled across the sky. The mansion groaned around her. But for the first time since arriving, Rosie wasn't afraid of the house. She was afraid of the people who once lived inside it. That night, she barely slept. She sat curled beneath a blanket in the old sitting room. Clara Lamber's burned journal resting in her lap while lightning flashed beyond the cracked windows. Page after page revealed fragments of horrifying truths. Her mother had once lived at Ravenwood Manor as a teenager. Not by choice. Rosie read about missing girls brought to the estate decades ago under the promise of shelter and work. Some were orphans, some runaways. Some simply disappeared from nearby towns and were never reported properly. The mansion had operated like a refuge on the surface. But underneath, something terrible had happened there. Clara never described everything directly. Most pages sounded terrified, rushed, paranoid, like someone writing while constantly looking over their shoulder. But one sentence appeared over and over throughout the journal. "They keep saying the house is cursed, but the house didn't hurt us. They did." Rosie stared at those words for a long time. Outside, rainwater slid down the mansion windows like tears. The house didn't hurt us. They did. Something shifted inside her then. Because her whole life, Rosie had believed tragedy followed her like a shadow. Her parents dying in the fire, losing her home, sleeping in shelters, being forgotten by everyone who was supposed to care. She always thought she came from nothing. But now she realized someone had buried the truth on purpose. Her mother hadn't abandoned this place. She escaped it. And somehow, Rosie had been led back. The realization made her chest ache. For the first time in years, Rosie cried. Not quiet tears. Not hidden tears. The kind that shook your entire body apart. She cried for her mother. For the children in the photographs. For the lonely little girl she used to be, sleeping in shelters believing nobody in the world had ever fought for her. But Clara had fought. God, she had fought so hard. The next morning, Rosie moved through Ravenwood Manor differently. Not like a frightened trespasser anymore. Like someone searching for answers. She reopened rooms she had avoided before. She studied the portraits lining the hallways. She searched drawers, closets, hidden compartments, and slowly a pattern emerged. Most of the mansion's records had been deliberately destroyed. Family names scratched out. Documents burned. Photographs ripped apart. Someone had tried very hard to erase what happened there, but they missed things. Tiny things. A newspaper clipping hidden inside a wall. A ledger buried beneath floorboards. Names carved beneath furniture. Rosie found one carving near the staircase that stopped her cold. Clara was here. 1978. Her fingers trembled as she traced the faded letters. Her mother had stood in this exact spot. terrified, alone, and just like her. And somehow, that made Rosie feel less alone, too. Later that afternoon, she drove into Blackwood Hollow hoping someone in town might finally tell her the truth. But the moment she mentioned Ravenwood Manor, people shut down instantly. At the diner, an old waitress nearly dropped a coffee pot when Rosie said the mansion's name. At the gas station, a man muttered. That place should have burned to the ground years ago. Nobody would explain further. Nobody wanted to talk. It was like the entire town shared the same secret, and feared it, finally. As Rosie stepped out of the small grocery store near sunset, an elderly woman stopped her quietly beside the sidewalk. "You're Clara's daughter," the woman said softly. Rosie froze. The woman looked nearly 80, frail. Pale blue eyes filled with something that looked painfully close to guilt. "You knew my mother," Rosie asked. The woman nodded slowly. "I knew what they did to those girls." Rosie's stomach dropped. Thunder rumbled overhead again. The old woman glanced nervously toward the road before leaning closer. "The house isn't evil, child," she whispered. "It's grieving." Rosie felt chills spread through her entire body. "What happened there?" she asked. The woman's eyes filled with tears. "People with power hurt children nobody would miss," she said quietly. "And when your mother tried to expose them," she stopped. Her voice broke. They silenced her. Rosie stopped breathing. "No," she whispered instantly. "My parents died in a fire. That fire wasn't an accident." The world seemed to tilt sideways. Rain began falling again. Cold. Heavy. The old woman grabbed Rosie's wrist tightly. "They thought they buried the truth with your mother," she whispered. "But Ravenwood remembers everything." Then she let go and walked away into the rain. Rosie stood frozen on the empty sidewalk long after the woman disappeared, because suddenly everything in her life looked different. Her parents' deaths, the mansion, the whispers, the photographs. This wasn't random. This wasn't fate. Someone had spent decades trying to keep the truth buried. And somehow, Rosie Lambert had just become the one person capable of uncovering it. For the first time in her life, Rosie Lambert stopped asking herself why everything had gone wrong. Instead, she started asking what she was supposed to do next. The rainstorm passed sometime before dawn, leaving Ravenwood Manor wrapped in heavy fog. Rosie stood alone on the front porch, arms folded tightly against the cold, staring out across the overgrown property. The mansion no longer looked haunted to her. It looked wounded, abandoned, silenced, and somehow she understood that feeling better than anyone. Behind her, the old house creaked softly as if listening. Rosie looked down at Clara's journal in her hands. Her mother had died trying to expose the truth buried inside Ravenwood. And now that truth had found its way back to her. The thought terrified her, but it also gave her something she hadn't felt in years. Purpose. That morning, Rosie opened every curtain in the mansion. Sunlight flooded rooms that had lived in darkness for decades. Dust swirled through the air like ghosts finally disturbed awake. She unlocked windows painted shut with time and let fresh air move through the halls. For hours, she cleaned, not because she cared about restoring some old mansion, but because every room felt like part of a story nobody finished telling. She dragged mold-covered furniture outside, swept shattered glass into piles, scrubbed soot stains from walls blackened by age and smoke, and little by little, Ravenwood Manor began to breathe again. By afternoon, Rosie made a decision. She drove into town and walked straight into the small public library near the courthouse. The librarian, a quiet middle-aged man named Walter, looked startled the moment she mentioned the mansion. "I need old newspaper archives," Rosie said. Anything connected to missing children, fires, orphanages, whatever happened at Ravenwood. Walter hesitated visibly. You should leave that place alone, he muttered. Rosie leaned forward. My mother died because somebody didn't. That shut him up. An hour later, Rosie sat alone in the archive room surrounded by dusty records and yellowed newspapers. The deeper she searched, the darker the story became. Children disappearing, girls running away from nearby shelters, reports quietly dismissed by police, and always somewhere in the background, Ravenwood Manor. But the strangest part wasn't what the articles said, it was what they avoided saying. Entire paragraphs blacked out, missing pages, names removed, like someone powerful had reached into history itself and edited the truth. Then Rosie found the article that changed everything. Dated October 12, 1998. Local woman dies in house fire. The article was short. Too short. Clara Lambert and husband Daniel Lambert were killed in a residential fire late Tuesday evening. Rosie's hands trembled. But beneath the article, scribbled faintly in blue ink by someone years ago, were 6 handwritten words. She told them she had proof. Rosie stopped breathing. Proof. Her mother died because she knew something. Something important enough to kill for. Rosie sat frozen in silence for a long time. Then slowly, the fear inside her started turning into rage. Not wild rage. Focused rage. The kind that sharpens you. Because suddenly, this wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about justice. That evening, Rosie returned to Ravenwood Manor carrying boxes of copied documents and newspaper records. Thunderclouds rolled across the distant sky again as she spread everything across the massive dining table inside the mansion. Photographs, articles, missing names, dates, patterns. The more she connected the pieces, the clearer the truth became. For decades, vulnerable children had been brought through Ravenwood Manor. Most were poor, homeless, forgotten by society. Just like Rosie once was. Some disappeared, some escaped, and those who tried speaking out were silenced. Rosie stared around the massive dining room. The chandeliers above her, the cracked portraits, the endless silence trapped inside the walls. Then slowly, an idea began forming in her mind. Not just about exposing the truth, about changing the future. The next morning, she painted over the rotten sign near the front gate. Ravenwood Manor. Beneath it, using shaky white paint, she added new words. Future home for lost girls. Rosie stepped back and stared at the sign, emotions tightening painfully in her chest. Because for the first time since losing her parents, she could finally imagine a future bigger than her pain. The days that followed were brutal. She worked non-stop, repairing broken doors, cleaning upstairs bedrooms, hauling out decades of ruined furniture. Some nights she collapsed onto the floor too exhausted to eat, but she kept going. And eventually, people noticed. One afternoon, a teenage girl from town quietly left groceries on the porch. The next day, an older mechanic offered Rosie spare tools. Then came blankets, paint cans, lumber. Nobody said much. But slowly, Blackwood Hollow began helping. Not because they weren't afraid of Ravenwood Manor anymore, but because maybe they were tired of pretending too. Weeks passed. The mansion changed. The foyer no longer smelled like decay. Sunlight touched polished floors again. Bedrooms, once frozen in darkness, slowly became livable. And with every repaired wall, Rosie felt herself healing too. One night, while clearing debris from the West Wing hallway, she discovered another hidden door behind peeling wallpaper. Her pulse quickened instantly. This door was different. stronger, locked from the outside, and carved into the wood were words that made her blood run cold. Don't let them take more. Rosie stared at the message silently, then rested her trembling hand against the door, somewhere deep inside the walls. She heard it again, the little girl's voice, soft, almost peaceful now. Help us. Tears filled Rosie's eyes instantly, because finally, she understood. The house wasn't asking her to run. It was asking her to finish what her mother started. And for the first time in her life, Rosie Lambert wasn't surviving anymore. She was becoming something far more dangerous. Someone who refused to stay silent. Rosie Lambert stopped sleeping with the lights on sometime during the second month at Ravenwood Manor. Not because the house had become less frightening, but because she had, somewhere between the broken windows, the endless dust, and the whispers hidden inside the walls, Rosie had changed. The scared homeless girl who arrived with nothing but a blanket and grief in the back seat of her car was disappearing, and in her place, someone stronger was beginning to emerge. Every morning now started the same way. Coffee brewing on the old stove she'd somehow managed to repair. Music humming softly from a radio donated by the mechanic in town. Sunlight spilling across floorboards that no longer looked abandoned. The mansion still carried scars, of course. Entire sections remained unsafe. The west wing stayed locked most nights. And sometimes, usually after midnight, Rosie still heard footsteps moving upstairs when nobody else was there. But the fear no longer owned her, because Ravenwood wasn't hiding from her anymore. It was revealing itself. And the deeper Rosie dug into its secrets, the more the town began changing too. Teenagers started helping repair the garden. Walter, from the library, delivered boxes of recovered records twice a week. Even people who once crossed the street to avoid her now nodded respectfully when she drove through Blackwood Hollow. For the first time in years, Rosie felt seen. Then came the girl. It happened late one evening during a thunderstorm. Rosie had been patching leaks in the ceiling when she heard frantic knocking at the front door. 3 fast knocks, then silence. When she opened it, a young girl stood trembling beneath the rain, maybe 14 years old. Thin, soaked, terrified. A swollen bruise darkened one side of her face. Rosie's chest tightened immediately. "Hey," she said gently. "You okay?" The girl looked over her shoulder nervously toward the road before whispering. "My mom's boyfriend found out I was leaving." Rosie didn't hesitate. "Get inside." The girl's name was Emma. She barely spoke that first night. Rosie made soup while Emma sat curled beneath blankets near the fireplace, staring around the mansion with frightened eyes. "You really live here?" she finally asked quietly. Rosie nodded. Emma looked toward the giant staircase disappearing into darkness. "Aren't you scared?" Rosie glanced around the old house for a long moment, then answered honestly. That night changed everything. Because by morning, Rosie realized Ravenwood Manor had already become what she intended it to be. A refuge. Not for ghosts. For survivors. Word spread quietly after that. Another girl arrived 2 weeks later. Then another. Not many. Just a few broken teenagers with nowhere safe left to go. Rosie never asked too many questions. She understood already. Pain recognized pain. And slowly, room by room, Ravenwood Manor became alive again. Laughter returned to the hallways. Music drifted through open windows. The kitchen smelled like real food instead of mold and dust. For the first time in decades, the mansion sounded human again. But peace never lasts long in places built on buried secrets. One night, Rosie woke suddenly to screaming. Not from the house. From outside. She bolted upright instantly. Emma stood in the hallway crying hysterically. There's someone outside. Rosie grabbed the flashlight and ran toward the front porch barefoot. At first, she saw nothing. Only darkness, rain, trees moving in the wind. Then the flashlight beam landed on the front gate, and Rosie's blood turned cold. Someone had painted words across the entrance in dripping red letters. "Leave the past dead." Emma gasped behind her. Rosie stepped closer slowly, pulse hammering. The paint looked fresh, very fresh, which meant someone had been watching the house, watching them. Then, suddenly, crash! A rock exploded through the front window beside them. Emma screamed. Rosie spun toward the yard just in time to see headlights disappearing down the road. A truck. Someone speeding away into the storm. For several seconds, nobody moved. Rain poured through the shattered window onto the floor. Emma looked terrified. Who would do this? Rosie already knew the answer. Someone afraid. Someone who didn't want the truth uncovered. That night, Rosie barely slept. She sat alone in the dining room staring at the broken window while thunder rolled outside. Her mind replayed everything she'd uncovered over the past weeks. How the missing children, the erased records, her mother's death, and now this. Whoever buried Ravenwood's secrets decades ago clearly wasn't gone, and they were beginning to panic. The realization should have terrified her. Instead, it made her angry. The next morning, Rosie drove straight to the sheriff's office carrying photographs of the vandalism. Sheriff Doyle, a broad man in his 60s with tired eyes, studied the pictures silently. Then he sighed heavily. "You need to stop digging," he muttered. Rosie stared at him. "Oh, you know something." The sheriff rubbed his jaw uncomfortably. "This town's been trying to survive a long time," he said carefully. "Some things are better left buried." Rosie leaned closer across the desk. Children died. A long silence followed. Then Sheriff Doyle said something that made her stomach drop. "Not all of them died." Rosie froze. "What?" The sheriff looked toward the closed office door before lowering his voice. "Years ago, some girls escaped Ravenwood. Your mother helped them disappear before the fire happened." Rosie's heartbeat quickened violently. "Where are they now?" "I don't know," he admitted. "But somebody else has been looking for them too." Before Rosie could speak again, the sheriff slid a yellowed photograph across the desk. "This was found near the mansion last night." Rosie picked it up carefully and nearly stopped breathing. The photo showed her mother standing beside 3 young girls outside Ravenwood Manor. But behind them, partially hidden in the shadows of the porch, was a man watching them. Tall, blurred, his face barely visible. But Rosie recognized him instantly, because she had seen that same man before. In the basement photographs, standing beside missing children, watching, always watching. And written across the back of the picture in faded ink were 5 horrifying words. He never left Ravenwood alive. Rosie looked up slowly. The sheriff's face had gone pale, because somewhere deep down, they both realized the same terrifying thing. If the man in the photograph never left Ravenwood Manor, then maybe he was still there. Rosie Lambert didn't return to Ravenwood Manor right away after leaving the sheriff's office. She drove aimlessly through Blackwood Hollow while rain streaked across the windshield, her hands trembling against the steering wheel. The photograph sat beside her. Her mother, the missing girls, and the man standing in the shadows behind them, watching, waiting. He never left Ravenwood alive. The words echoed endlessly inside her head. Every instinct screamed at her to leave town, to pack whatever she could into the Honda and disappear before the same darkness swallowed her too. That's what the old Rosie would have done. The girl who spent years surviving one night at a time. The girl who believed the world only knew how to take things from her. But somewhere along the way, Ravenwood Manor had changed her. Or maybe it had simply revealed who she already was. By the time Rosie pulled back onto the dirt road leading home, the storm had finally stopped. Fog drifted low across the property, and for the first time since she arrived, the mansion no longer looked frightening. It looked tired, like something that had carried pain for too long. Rosie stepped out of the car slowly. The porch lights glowed warmly now. Through the front window she could see movement inside Emma, helping one of the younger girls set the dining table, while soft music played somewhere upstairs. Life. There was life inside Ravenwood again. Rosie stood there staring at the house with tears quietly filling her eyes, because suddenly she understood something her mother had known all along. The mansion wasn't cursed. Silence was. Secrets were. Fear was. And the moment people stopped being afraid of the truth, the darkness began losing its power. Inside, the girls greeted Rosie with nervous smiles. Emma immediately noticed something was wrong. "What happened?" she asked softly. Rosie looked around at all of them. 5 girls now. 5 kids with bruises no one talked about. Histories nobody wanted to hear. Children the world had already started forgetting, just like it forgot the girls before them. Rosie swallowed hard. Then she made a decision. "No more hiding," she said quietly. That night, for the first time, Rosie told them everything. About her mother, about the missing children, about Ravenwood Manor, about the people who spent decades burying the truth. The girls listened silently while firelight danced across the old walls around them. Some cried, some looked angry, but none of them looked afraid, because they understood something adults often forget. Broken people recognize courage faster than anyone. When Rosie finished speaking, silence settled across the room. Then Emma asked quietly, "So what happens now?" Rosie looked around the mansion slowly, at the repaired walls, the lit candles, the old photographs she'd begun hanging near the staircase so the forgotten children would finally be seen again. Then she smiled through tears. "Now," she whispered, "we stop surviving." The next morning, Blackwood Hollow woke up to something nobody expected. Reporters. 3 news vans lined the street outside Ravenwood Manor by sunrise. Someone, probably Walter from the library, had leaked copies of the recovered documents overnight. Within hours, the story exploded. Missing children. Corruption. Buried records. A decades-old cover-up hidden inside an abandoned mansion. People came from neighboring towns, historians, journalists, survivors, and among them, former girls from Ravenwood. Older now, gray-haired, fragile, but alive. One woman arrived carrying a photograph of herself at 14 years old, standing in front of the mansion. Another broke down sobbing the moment she stepped into the foyer. Rosie hugged every single one of them. Some whispered thank you. Others simply cried against her shoulder. And suddenly, Ravenwood Manor transformed into something nobody ever imagined. Not a haunted house, a place of reckoning. A place where forgotten voices finally returned home. That evening, as the sun began setting behind the trees, dozens of people gathered outside beneath strings of lights Rosie and the girls had hung across the porch. Candles flickered everywhere. The old cemetery behind the mansion had been cleaned earlier that day. Fresh flowers rested beside weathered graves no one had visited in years. Rosie stood quietly on the porch steps, staring at the crowd gathered below her. Her hands shook slightly. Not from fear, from emotion. Because for most of her life, Rosie Lambert believed she was invisible. Just another homeless girl sleeping in parking lots while the world looked away. And now, people were listening. She stepped forward slowly. The crowd fell silent. Rosie looked down at Clara's journal in her hands before speaking. "My mother died trying to protect girls nobody cared about," she said softly. "Girls people thought would never matter enough to search for." Tears filled several eyes in the crowd. Rosie's voice trembled, but she kept going. "I spent years believing I came from nothing. No home, no family, no purpose." She glanced back at Ravenwood Manor glowing warmly behind her. "But this house taught me something." A long pause. "The people society forgets are still people." Silence covered the property completely now. Even the wind seemed to stop. Rosie swallowed hard. "Ravenwood Manor won't belong to fear anymore," she whispered, "and it won't belong to silence." Then she looked toward the girls standing near the doorway behind her. "Emma, the others, safe, alive. Home, it belongs to survivors." For several seconds, nobody moved. Then someone began clapping softly. Another joined in. Then another, until the entire property filled with applause and crying, and people holding each other beneath the fading Louisiana sky. Rosie stood frozen as emotion crashed through her chest. Because for the first time since losing her parents, she finally understood something. Home was never a building. It was the place where your pain stopped being carried alone. Later that night, after everyone left, Rosie sat quietly on the front porch wrapped in a blanket while warm light glowed through Ravenwood's windows behind her. The house creaked softly in the darkness. Not painfully anymore. Peacefully, like something finally allowed to rest. Rosie looked up toward the stars with tears in her eyes, and smiling softly, she whispered, "We're still here, Mom," somewhere deep inside the mansion. A floorboard creaked gently in reply, not like a warning, not like a ghost, but like a voice finally saying, "You brought us home." Sometimes the most broken places are simply waiting for someone brave enough to care. Rosie Lambert spent years believing she was forgotten, homeless, alone, and invisible to the world. But when she uncovered the truth hidden inside Ravenwood Manor, she realized something powerful. The real danger was never the house. It was the silence. By choosing to face the past instead of running from it, Rosie gave forgotten people a voice and turned a place filled with pain into a home filled with hope. Because healing begins the moment someone decides that suffering should no longer stay hidden. There are people around us every day who feel abandoned and unseen. Sometimes, a little kindness, understanding, or support can completely change someone's life. Rosie's story reminds us that even people with nothing can still become the reason others survive. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs hope today.